Hey, good afternoon. Welcome back to the Perspectives in Global Development Seminar Series. I'm Terry Tucker. It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Deborah Arrindell to speak with us today. Dr. Arrindell's tireless efforts on behalf of Cornell are well known to many of us. She's currently a university trustee, member of the CAL's advisory committee, and I couldn't count how many alumni leadership roles you've occupied over the years, but it's many. Thank you for all that you do to keep this place a vital, vibrant institution. Following completion of a baccalaureate degree here at Cornell in biology in CALS, she went on to earn an MD and a Master in Public Health degree, a dual MD, MPH degree at Yale School of Medicine. In following residency and fellowship at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, Dr. Arrindell entered medical practice. Then some years later, she earned a law degree at the University of Maryland and began a new phase of her career that drew upon that broad training and expertise that included the biological sciences, medicine, public health, and law. And over the past 2 decades, Dr. Arrindell has held several key leadership positions in top biopharmaceutical companies, including her current role as a vice president at Global Blood Therapeutics, a firm whose mission is to provide a global functional cure for patients living with sickle cell anemia. So it's that story of that work that she will share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Arrindell. So thank you.
Good afternoon, but I probably just have to make a little correction. I'm no longer at GBT, and we'll kind of talk about that because GBT no longer exists because it got acquired by Pfizer. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So this afternoon, I'm just going to talk to you about my story and how everything really came together for me in terms of being a physician, the medical degree, and being able to help patients. So the title of my talk is The Intersection of Health Equity and Drug Development, How One Company Wrote Its Own Success Story. So I just have to give a disclaimer that these opinions, views, conclusions that I'm going to present to you today, they're entirely my own and should not be attributed to any past, current, or future employer. Okay, so I think everybody knows what the definition of health equity is, but just simply put, health equity is where everyone has a fair opportunity to obtain their highest level of health. And this comes from the CDC, what is health equity? And the first one it requires, it shouldn't that it requires injustices, but it's really that it requires us to make sure that we understand what injustices were from the past and from the present, and to really understand them and what impact they may have on health equity or people not being able to achieve health equity. Then it's also important to understand the determinants of health, such as economics, neighborhoods, where people live, language barriers, any of those things that may prevent them from attaining their highest level of health. And then lastly, it's about identifying preventable health disparities and creating strategies to remove them. So just a few known health disparities in people of color. People of color, for example, hypertension. So we know that more African Americans have hypertension. Cancer, we know that for many times people of color, when they get diagnosed with cancer, they're usually at a more advanced stage, for example, with prostate cancer. So prostate cancer in Black men, they're 3 times more likely to die of their cancer. Asthma, we know that communities of color have very high prevalences of asthma. And then the one that I'm going to talk about today is sickle cell anemia, which is a disease which is primarily focused in people of color. You know, there's other things that we can talk about. Recently, we just experienced COVID-19. We know that people of color in those communities were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I think everybody's been aware of in the news these negative outcomes in women who are pregnant, especially in the African American communities. But today, we're just going to focus on sickle cell anemia. And if people feel like they need to stop to ask a question, please do. So the history of sickle cell anemia in the US, it's actually quite fascinating that as far back as 1846, there was an article about a case of absent spleen that described some autopsy findings in a runaway slave who was accused of murder and executed. But really, it wasn't until about 1910 that James Hendrick and his intern, Ernest Irons, were actually credited with using science to actually put a name to this disease, so sickle cell disease. So what is sickle cell disease? So sickle cell disease is a disease that you can find all over the globe. So you can find it in African Americans. It's estimated that there's probably about 100,000 African Americans in this country that are impacted with sickle cell disease. Globally, you could go to sub-Saharan Africa, you could go to India, you can go to the West Indies or any of those islands. This is where you will find sickle cell disease. So it's estimated somewhere maybe between 20 million people globally are impacted by sickle cell disease. So what happens is normally your red blood cells are round, but in patients with sickle cell disease, the red blood cells are actually sickled, so they look like a sickle. Unfortunately, with the sickled red blood cell, you're unable to carry oxygen in your blood. And therefore, these are the symptoms that you end up having. So for example, end organ damage. So patients with sickle cell anemia suffer from kidney disease. They can have lung disease. They can have heart disease. But really what the hallmark is, the lack of oxygen leads to these painful crises. The average lifespan for a patient with sickle cell anemia, and this is still true probably as of today, is about 30 years shorter than other people. So for example, many patients with sickle cell die when they're about 40 or 45. Patients with sickle cell disease actually have higher rates of stroke, even compared to African Americans without disease. Many of the patients with sickle cell disease, because this is a chronic disease, they're unable to go to school. For many, they're unable to go to college, they're unable to hold jobs. So therefore, many of them receive Medicaid as opposed to private insurance. A lot of these patients with sickle cell, because of this is a chronic disease, they're forced to seek their medical care in the emergency room for these sickle cell crises. And for a lot of these patients, they're often thought to be seeking drugs, and they're often ignored, and sometimes they're often referred to as sicklers. One of the patients that actually was on the drug that I'm going to talk about, he would say that when he had a sickle cell crisis, he would actually put on a suit before he went to the ER because he didn't want people to think that he was there because he was seeking drugs. And then interesting enough too, and I found this to be very interesting because I remember when I was in medical school at Yale, I did take care of some patients with sickle cell anemia. I remember taking care of them even at the University of Maryland when I did my pediatric residence. But for many of these universities, there actually weren't sickle cell anemia centers where you had a lot of doctors who had a lot of experience with these drugs. And just to kind of give you another little story, one of the, there's a football player whose daughter has sickle cell anemia, and he moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And this is just about 2 years ago. And unfortunately, she had a sickle cell crisis. And he took they went to Stanford, and Stanford actually really didn't even have enough physicians there that were familiar with the disease. He actually had to call back to Philadelphia to get them to get on the phone to really talk about how to treat this patient. So it still is sort of mind-boggling that we've known about this disease so long, but we really hadn't made any progress. Okay, and this was just a slide that kind of just talks over the things that I kind of went over, that this is why you can really consider sickle cell disease, maybe like even the poster child or hallmark of when you talk about health inequity. Okay, so then I'll just switch very quickly just to talk about drug development and health disparities. So if you think about it, for a novel drug, it really can help improve people's lives. So we know that drugs can improve people's lives. So then you kind of have to think, well, if we've known this long about sickle cell disease, why hasn't there really been done, something done about it? But it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop a new drug. And I think in 2020, the median cost was around 985 million, while the average cost was around 1.3 billion. The budget of large pharma companies can be around 15 billion to 30 billion. So they have a lot of money. So one would think, why wouldn't they invest in this? But you also have to realize that the cost of that research, so that 15 billion to 30 billion, they need to make back through sales. And just sort of to put that in perspective, I don't know how many people are familiar with Lipitor, but that was Pfizer's drug for cholesterol. Over the life of its patent, that drug made $180 billion. So you can see why pharma companies may not want to invest their research dollars in those areas where, for example, the patient population is small, right? So sickle cell anemia, 100,000 patients, where the return on their investment may not be great. Because again, I said that most of these patients have Medicaid. So it's unlikely that there's going to be any insurance companies that are going to sort of pay for this drug. And at the end of the day, it's also about patients who might not have, access to, for example, large treatment medical centers or things like that. So now on to sickle cell. It was only in 1995 that the FDA approved hydroxyurea for sickle cell patients. But hydroxyurea was not a novel drug. It actually was a drug that was used for patients with cancer. So again, going back to how I was trying to set it up, we've known about it since 1800s, 1910, but it's really not until 1995 that there's even one drug that was approved for sickle cell, and it's not even a novel drug. Okay, so then enter Global Blood Therapeutics. So Global Blood Therapeutics was a small biotech company up in South San Francisco. It was founded in 2011, and the scientists' goal, their mission, was to develop a novel treatment for sickle cell. So the first drug that they worked on was oxalitor, which then went on to be approved by the FDA, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And it's known as Oxbryta. The company went public in 2015, so it was listed on the NASDAQ. Dr. Ted Love was appointed CEO and president 2014. And Dr. Ted Love is an African-American. Actually, we went to medical school together at Yale. And then also something that was sort of out of the ordinary, Dr. Ted Love appointed Dr. Kim Smitley-Whitley as the head of research. And again, that was a little bit novel and sort of off the beaten path. Why? Because she was African-American, she was a woman, and she was appointed head of research. And usually you don't see that in pharmaceutical companies. And then Oxbryta was approved by the US FDA in 2019. It was an oral pill taken once daily, so there were 3 pills. And again, this was novel because this was actually really could be considered a functional cure. Remember, I had said that with sickle cell anemia, the drugs are sickled. So by taking this drug, it actually prevents that sickling. And if the red blood cells are not sickled, then you're able to pick up more oxygen. In 2020, the company started an early access program in the EU. And that sort of was another eye-opener as well, that in Europe, the patients with sickle cell anemia also didn't have any good sort of mechanism to really treat them. And sort of the same things that you were seeing in the US in terms of healthcare disparities, you were also seeing it in the EU. So there was an early access program started in the EU. And what an early access program is, it just allows patients to have access to the drug before it actually gets approved in that particular country. Then in January of 2021, Oxbryta was approved by the European Medicine Agency. Then in 2022, GBT was acquired by Pfizer for $5.6 billion. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. So just some things, it's sort of like, so that's GBT, the building, that's Dr. Ted Love. This picture with the three people, the one in the middle is Dr. Smith, where GBT actually received a Research in Excellence Award. I think that was in 2020. And then that's an actual picture of Oxbryter. So GBT was able to return value for its shareholders, because the other piece of sometimes why maybe companies don't want to invest in these types of drugs that will address healthcare disparities is because at the end of the day, really to get this company on its way to get on the road to drug development, you need people who are going to invest in that. So it could be venture capitals, it could be, individuals, but at the end of the day, if they're investing in it, they want to see a return on their money. And actually, GBT was able to do that. And I just think that this is sort of interesting because, again, it just speaks to what GBT was able to do. Some people actually describe this transaction, so the buyout of GBT by Pfizer, as implausible, but actually it was able to be undertaken. And I think we have to thank, Ted Love and his team for really being able to work with Wall Street and really return that shareholders' value. So what was the strategy for success of GBT? I think one of the things is really about leadership. So for me, it was really, it was just really a good place to work at, to really know that the person at the top, the person at the helm was actually somebody that you've known, basically since you were, 25 or whenever you went into sort of medical school. And I think the other piece was that not only did you know him, but you knew what his values were, you knew what his missions were. And so everybody could sort of all get on the same page. The other thing was being able to see people that looked like me in places of leadership. And again, when you look at Dr. Kim, she was a world-class expert in sickle cell anemia. She was an African-American woman. And then if you think about it, the community that we were trying to serve, they could relate to her because, right, she was African-American, but also because she had treated them. And one of the things that she used to say all the time was, we need to leave the communities better than what we found them. And then it was also interesting from that perspective to meet Kobe. That's affectionately what he's known, Kobe. He was actually head of cell and translational biology. And again, it's just seeing somebody that's invested in what they're doing because he's originally from Africa. He had he had people in his family that had died of sickle cell disease. So this, again, the passion, the mission was there. And so just talking about passion, one of the things that GBT was really good on was this aggressive focus on diversity of employees, having a diverse workforce across the entire organization, I think really helped GBT get to where it needed to be. And that was not only GBT in the US, but as well as GBT around the world. GBT was able to instill trust in the community. And that's really important because I think, historically, you're probably familiar with, there's this sort of distrust sometimes in the community, especially African-American communities, about pharma companies, about doing clinical trials, sort of things like that. And then I think what I really enjoyed about GBT was the social responsibility. So the joke was that GBT was actually a social justice company that made drugs. So that mission to really sort of justify a wrong that had been done was sort of permeated throughout the company. And I think that's really what put GBT on its path to success. And then just community engagement, because that's really, really important. So GBT really listened to the community. GBT went out into the community. I got there when COVID had just started. So as you could imagine, that COVID had a really, disproportionate impact on people of color in the African-American communities. And you still needed to do your clinical trials. So GBT had to kind of adjust and figure out, well, how can we continue to run these clinical trials in these times of COVID? And GBT did a lot of support of the sickle cell community. And then I think, as Ted would say too, the vision. So the long-term vision was to, develop this drug, get it approved, and then be able to distribute it globally. Because as you can imagine, in some of these other countries like sub-Saharan Africa, being able to have a pill that you can actually take for sickle cell is really going to make a difference in their lives. Because remember, I kind of said up until 1995, the only thing that got approved was the hydroxyurea. But even for these countries that don't have access to hydroxyurea, because again, remember, some of these countries, you might have to actually pay for that drug. Really, it was just supportive care. So for example, blood transfusions, if you got a crisis, or pain management. So actually having a drug that can be distributed globally, you don't have to worry that you have to store it in a refrigerator. You don't, all of those things really, it's going to make a big impact in people's lives globally with sickle cell anemia. So then I'll just sort of conclude. So I actually like this quote from Martin Luther King, because he said, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman, because it often results in physical death." And so for sickle cell anemia, I think that's so true, because these patients had gone so many years without having novel treatments that it really did impact their lives, their ability to get an education, ability to have work. And I think at the end of the day, what GBT was able to do is really, going to play a major role in patients' lives. What I'd like to see, for example, 10 years from now, is some data to come back out that's really going to say, you know what, since the approval of Oxbryta, patients with sickle cell, their lives, their lifespan has actually increased. So I think I'll just leave you with drug development can and must play a key role in solving healthcare inequities. So I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arrindell. I think we have ample time for quick Q&A and discussion. So I'll ask that you identify yourself and make your question as brief as possible, so we can accommodate as many questions as possible. For those who are joining in online, kindly type your question in the chat, and we'll try to get to you in time. So,
thank you, Ed. So first, thank you very much. I have two quick questions. The first one being, what exactly does this drug target? Does it target the pain crises, or does it target general symptoms and problems overall?
Yeah, so basically the fundamental issue with sickle cell anemia is that those sickle cells, they don't carry enough oxygen. So that means, for example, your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, your heart, your lungs, your bones, anything. So basically what this drug does, it's what we call a functional cure. So it inhibits the hemoglobin from sickling, just in layman's terms. So hopefully now that you have oxygen being carried to all of your organs, you're going to have overall better health. So, you'll have less painful crises, you'll have less cardiac symptoms, you'll have less end organ damage. And I should have mentioned too that we also did get a line extension in pediatric patients. So it also got approved for pediatric patients down to the age of 4. Then you had another question.
And then my second question is, I actually have a rare disease, an untreatable rare disease. And so my question there is, I do a lot of stuff in patient advocacy, and I was wondering if you could talk about the racial dynamics in patient advocacy and the way that plays out as well, in whose voices we hear on the patient rather than the doctor and medical side.
Yeah, no, yes, that's actually a really good point. And that's one of the things too that's actually very, very important in drug development is actually to hear from the patient, right? So it doesn't make sense to make a drug and the patient's not going to take it or the patient can't afford it or things like that. So patient advocacy is very, very, very important. And that was one of the things, again, why I think GBT was so successful. For example, having people like the head of R&D, Kim, she was a very well-known sickle cell disease expert out of Philadelphia. So she knew all of the people. I mean, it's just really fascinating, when you start sitting down. That's maybe one of the things that I didn't talk about, but I'll mention that in a few minutes, was that there's only sickle cell patients, if you look at a map across the US, they're only concentrated in certain places in the US because it makes sense, right? It's a disease of patients with that are African Americans. And similarly, when you start looking at where these patients go to get their care, there are patients that, like, for example, could be in New York. They travel to Philadelphia. There are patients that are in Florida. They travel to Philadelphia because there's just not enough physicians who have sickle cell disease knowledge to really take care of them. But going back to your question, patient advocacy, that is really, really key. And interesting enough, one part of drug development now is really about having the patient's voice. So as you're developing these drugs, you really need to make sure that you have the patient's voice as part of that process.
The question back here.
Hi, my name is Awa. My question is about the acquisition of GBT by Pfizer. I was wondering on your take, would the acquisition of the acquisition of GBT by Pfizer, which is a really big corporation, affect the rollout and distribution of the drug? And then also, how would it affect the mission of GBT overall?
Yeah, so that's another good question. So again, it was actually a bittersweet moment. And, going back to Ted, his vision, his leadership, he actually cried when we got acquired by, GBT. I don't know if people know, but sometimes when you get acquired by a company, all of the stock that you've had in the company, right, it sort of gets cashed out. Like the other companies buying you, they have to buy your stock. But for a lot of us, right, it wasn't so much the money. It's like, this is what we were losing, that this family, this GBT. But to the other point that you're trying to make, at some point in time, right, I think GBT knew that it would have to partner with somebody bigger if it really wanted to fulfill its mission globally to get things rolled out in, sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of the world. So to your point about hoping that Pfizer continues the mission, yes. And I hope the people that are left there from GBT, and I hope the management at Pfizer does continue the mission of GBT, because obviously they have the resources to be able to go to like sub-Saharan Africa or India or any of these other places. Did that answer your question?
I have one question. This case a lot happened in Laos, and what is the cause of the sickle cell anemia?
So sorry, I missed the first part.
What is the cause of sickle cell anemia?
Oh, so what is the cost that the health, to the healthcare system, or what are the costs of the drug?
The cause.
Oh, the cause. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yeah. So the cause is, it's actually a genetic mechanism of action. So basically hemoglobin, there should be 2 A's, but in sickle cell, it actually you get what you call 2 S's. So it's genetic. And what it is that you have, let's say, for example, one patient who is heterozygous, so they could have the S gene and they could have the A gene, but then they have a mate that also has the S gene and the A gene, and everybody's taking their genetics here, that 5-credit course that you probably know about it, right? So then unfortunately it gets passed to a child who becomes, has hemoglobin SS.
Hi, my name is Saha. I wanted to say thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I think it's like really inspirational seeing a woman of color in medicine, and especially like working in like grassroots efforts. I don't think we see a lot of that. So like, and I also want to go into medicine and do something similar. So I really appreciated that. My question was, what were like some unprecedented like hurdles you faced working within a community that you didn't expect? Because I understand like you were saying that a lot of the people that were working in GBT like had some sort of tie within the community, but were there still some hurdles that you faced that you weren't kind of expecting in terms of like collaboration? And like, and then the second part of my question is like, what are your concerns in terms of like connecting within an external community since you guys are hoping to branch out like internationally, and how do you expect to like go over those?
Yeah, so I think again, working with GBT, that was sort of one of the most interesting things, because there were a lot of things that people would say that, oh, that'll never happen. You guys are never going to get that done, but we got it done. And back to your comment about the community, I think, historically in the African American community, there's been distrust of, big pharma. I think there in the African American community, historically, there has been some reluctance to join clinical trials. I think maybe everybody is familiar with the Tuskegee experiment and the implications of this, but GBT was really able to overcome that. And again, I think because like for example, Ted would say how he would go visit some of these communities or go to some of these sites. Again, having somebody like him, the medical monitors that we had, or some of the other physicians that worked at GBT, they were actually plucked from some of these communities to actually come into GBT to sort of do this research. One of my best stories about GBT was a group went to I think did they go to Nigeria? No, I think it was Ghana. So they went to Ghana because, that was the other thing, right? I think GBT is probably one of the few companies, pharmaceutical companies, that actually ran clinical trials in Africa. Because most of the time, if you go to a pharma company and you talk about running clinical trials in Africa, they're like, oh, no, we can't do that. The infrastructure is just not there. But we were able to successfully run clinical trials in Africa. The data was of the quality that it could actually, it supported a approval. But again, I think it goes back to the community. So the little anecdote I was going to tell you about, this group went to Africa to kind of set up some clinical trials. And one of the investigators told him, he was like, hey, I've been waiting for you guys for like 40 years. I've been waiting for somebody for 40 years to come here and actually, do some clinical trials with sickle cell disease and really help this community. And then I think the other piece, I think the last piece you were talking about was the external piece of it, sort of. Yeah, and again, and Ted can talk to that as well, trying to get financing, right? I talked to you about how you need to have financing to kind of keep these companies going, because you're not really, you're in the early stages, you're not really making a lot of money that's kind of going back into your budget and sort of things like that. But again, trying to get, financing. There were people that said, oh, we have no interest in working with you, these Black patients. And that's what they said, right? They're not going to take that medicine. You're never going to sell the drug, sort of things like that. But I think at the end, all of the hurdles that were thrown towards GBT was able to successfully overcome them.
More questions? I will ask a question, Dr. Arrindell. I have a two-part question. One is, I do understand reading somewhere that this mutation conferred some advantage for against malaria in this
Yes.
heterogeneous. I just wanted confirmation.
Yes.
That's correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe the second question is, since you also did law and legal studies, is there something in the patent system itself that could be fixed to ensure that there's incentives for companies to treat these conditions that affect or that don't have a big payoff at the end of the day? Is there something that can be done with the patent system?
Yeah, no, that's actually an interesting question as well. But that whole patent law sort of goes over my head. sort of goes over my head a little bit. But I think it's just more than the patent law. I think it's really laws that really give pharmaceutical companies incentives to kind of do this type of work. But to your point, though, some of those incentives, those laws, they do tack on, for example, if it's a rare disease, you might get 2 extra years of patent life as opposed to if it was a non-rare disease. But it's actually kind of interesting too, because I think rare diseases in the US would be classified as anything that impacts less than 200,000 people. But obviously outside of the US, right, sickle cell is not a rare disease. So then how do you work with, companies outside of the US? But I really think it's really towards, policies that really provide incentives to these pharmaceutical companies to sort of make these types of investments. Because the other thing that I didn't get into was, just going back to patients with sickle cell disease, they're in and out of the ERs, right? So there's data to suggest that patients with sickle cell disease, if they get admitted to the hospital, they're more likely to be readmitted within 30 days compared to patients with non-sickle cell disease. So there's a high cost to the burden of having sickle cell disease. But it would make sense if the government would actually, work with pharma companies to sort of address these types of drug development. One thing that I also didn't get into was, I think everybody's aware, hopefully you're aware, that recently there have been 2 new gene therapies that have been approved for sickle cell anemia. Now, it works. So we're talking about gene therapy, but can anybody guess what the cost is? So it's probably about $2 million per patient. So again, just think about what I said, US 100,000 patients. Most of these patients are on Medicaid. Who really is going to get these drugs? And there was just an article maybe about last week where somebody was opining on that, who's a sickle cell expert, and was just saying it's just not going to happen, right? And then if you think about it globally, what country is going to be able to support, right, spending $2 million $2 million on patients? And not only that, you need to have the right infrastructure to kind of do this sort of gene therapy. So that's why, again, if you go back to the mission of what GBT was trying to do, right? And that's why I always say there's a lot of pharma companies that they say they're global, but I say sometimes, well, I don't really think you're global. Why? Because you're not creating drugs for a global population. So again, going back to what GBT tried to do, let's try to find a drug that will work globally, meaning it's a pill. There was a follow-on to voxelotor 601, which Pfizer now has the rights to. So that actually would be 1 pill once a day. But can you just imagine what 1 pill once a day can do on a global level? Like I said, you don't have to worry about sort of the transportation of it. You don't have to worry about it has to be kept in a refrigerator. GBT was also looking at a pediatric kind of suspension formula. So again, it just goes back to why I think GBT was special, is that when it set out to do this, right, its intent, its mission really was to provide a global cure.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. Seeing sickle cell on the board, it was kind of like seeing my name up there. Being born with things that are related to it, and listening to your journey going through different colleges to educate yourself, whether it was medicine, whether it was law, and all that you did to get there. I guess my question is more of a personal one of, what did that do for you, or how did you even survive that journey to get to that place? Because as I'm sitting here, and there was a weight in the presentation for me because I felt the struggle in just to get the education to get there, getting the breakthrough, but still having the hurdle. And while I'm happy that there is a breakthrough and there is a drug, there is also a lot more, there's still a way to go. And sometimes when people make talks and presentation, we just say, oh, that's for them, and they don't understand the magnitude of what just happened. Just sitting here, it was very heavy for me. So I guess what my question is what was that journey like for you personally, mentally, just to see that happened, that, hey, we have something that can treat. And
Oh, yeah, no. Thank you for that. Again, like I would say, for me, it's sort of, being at GBT sort of brought it all together. It sort of brought together understanding what it meant to be African-American, what it meant to be an African-American physician. Like, for example, we were in a room one day and the only 3 physicians in the room were 3 African-American physicians. And again, I'll probably never experience anything like GBT in my life, kind of. So I think there was that part of it. There was, the part of having somebody like Dr. Ted Love. And the reason I keep bringing Ted up is because his journey is just unbelievable. He was born to 2 parents in Alabama who did not finish the 5th grade. Right. So here's a man who was able to go to, I think it's Wesleyan College undergrad, but then I met him at Yale Medical School, finish up cardiology at Harvard. He then was head of like 2 or 3 other companies. One of them actually, which was called Onyx, that another company that I worked at, bought out. So I think there's just all of these things that GBT sort of just brought it all together. When you talk about my public health degree, again, just like, wow, I've been out of medical school 40 years, more or less, and things still have not changed. But, and then just being able to really do something, I think, that impacts your community. So that's really what GBT was. And like I said, Ted cried. He actually cried because GBT got bought out by Pfizer, right? Because what we had tried to accomplish, what he accomplished, what he pulled together. So again, for me, working at GBT, it kind of just said, you know what? If you have the passion, if you're dedicated to a mission, and you really, really want to make an impact in people's lives, you can get it done. But you just have to have the right people around you.
Thank you. I understand there were a couple of questions online, but you already addressed them.
Okay.
So maybe there's one more question. Yes, please go ahead. Can you speak up?
Thank you for your presentation. Hi, I just was wondering, because it is like sickle cell anemia is genetically caused, are there any efforts for genetic screening, like making sure that, like, seeing if 2 people who are
Right.
like have recessive traits don't get married, or is it not like deadly enough to, like, I know those can border on eugenics type conversations, so I was curious if that.
Yeah, no, and I
being
should
talked
have
about.
mentioned that, but in the interest of time, it might have been even in the 1960s when there actually became, as part of neonatal screening, they actually included sickle cell as part of the neonatal training. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries, they do try to give that sort of counseling, that if you're interested in, you have a mate or somebody, you probably both should go ahead and get tested to see if you both have the trait. But yeah.
Dr. Arrindell, I'll ask one final question, to this on behalf of the students. So at some point, imagine yourself sitting in an audience like this when you're doing undergraduate or grad. What would you think differently, given the experience and journey you've been through? what do you think you would want to learn and know and understand at this stage of your career, not knowing what the future holds?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, what I would have wanted to know was that, and I think this is sort of what my journey kind of told me, is that, again, if there's something that you're passionate about, if there's something that you really think that you can make a difference about, you can do it. I think you just need to have that passion. But most importantly, right, you need to surround yourself with people that have that same passion, right? There wasn't anybody at GBT who said, for example, oh, you want to go do a clinical trial in Ghana? Oh, don't do it, right? But if you went to some other big pharma company, I can tell you right now, oh, we don't run clinical trials in sort of Africa. Oh, African Americans, they don't enter in clinical trials. You're never going to get them to come back to the clinic and so on and so forth. So I think at the end of the day, and this is why I think you can make a difference, right? And I think you can make a difference. And guess what? People made money, right, off of it as well. But it's just that if you have this vision, and you have this passion, go for it. But make sure you surround, yourself with people that share that vision and share that passion. And I think that that's what made GBT successful in what it was able to achieve.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent talk and for all the work that you've done. Can you give a round of applause from Cornell?